Hey, this is Connor from Biker's Edge. We're back at it with another Giant Trance X video, and this time it's got Flight Attendant. We've got a pretty cool bike today. It's the Giant Trance X, but this is the SE or the Special Edition, which has a really nice build kit on it, and it has the new RockShox Flight Attendant system on it. So this video is going to be part bike review, part flight attendant review, and hopefully 100% entertaining and informative. So if you are new here and haven't already seen our Giant Trance X review, I'd go back and I'd start there because that's going to kind of lay all of the groundwork for what we're talking about today. And after you watch that one, watch the Trance X video where we rode it with live valve, because we will be comparing and contrasting live valve and flight attendant today. Really quick numbers on the Trance X before we dive in. It has 135 millimeters of rear travel. It has a 150 millimeter fork, two 29-inch wheels. And this bike is the SE build or the Special Edition, and it's a pretty nice build. There's a Lyric Ultimate up front. There's a Super Deluxe for the rear suspension. Of course, both of those are equipped with Flight Attendant. It has a GX X01 blend Axis drivetrain. It has carbon everything parts. And to my liking, it has TRP Trail Evo brakes. All in all, it offers a hell of a value at $8,500. I cannot believe those words just came out of my mouth, but considering this bike has all the bells and whistles, all the carbon, all the bling, and flight attendant, and it's only $8,500, pretty decent deal there, considering the average price for every other bike that comes with flight attendant is over $11,000. I'll quickly talk about how this bike rides. Again, if you haven't watched it already, go watch the original review because that's where you'll get the full story. The Trance X is one of those bikes that blurs the lines between categories. And for me, it blurs the lines between the trail and the all-mountain category, where it climbs very, very quickly. It has that quick, responsive, lively handling with steeper geometry, but you know, it's kind of pushing all-mountain category on the travel numbers. The number one word I used to describe it in the original review was boingy. And that holds true today. This bike is incredibly poppy and playful. It's very easy to bunny hop and very easy to get off the ground. It's not the kind of bike I would choose to push the pace on really tough technical downhill terrain, but it is capable enough that it will handle pretty much any trail that I'd be willing to ride. I don't think I'd ever use it as an excuse to not ride a trail. It's the kind of bike that rewards an active riding style by offering quick, responsive handling and a firm, supportive suspension platform for pumping and jumping and cornering. The more you ride it and are in charge, the better it becomes. It really just strikes a nice balance in pretty much every aspect for a bike that's supposed to be able to go most places. So now let's dive into RockShox Flight Attendant. What is it? How do you set it up? And how good is it? So boiled down into its most basic parts, Flight Attendant is an electronic suspension controller that makes compression adjustments on the fly based on information it's getting from sensors on the bike. It's basically the same as a robot flipping levers on your suspension very quickly and probably smarter than we could ourselves. The idea is that the compression is always where you want it to be. You're climbing, it's more locked out or it's firm. You're descending, it's open. You're on rolling terrain and it's in kind of a middle setting that gives you more pedal efficiency, but it's not fully locked out, so you still have traction. So there are multiple sensors on the bike and the suspension components. There's even a pedal sensor that can tell if you're pedaling or coasting. And all of these work together to let the system decide if it should remain open, which is its default setting, or if it should firm up or lock out to give you more efficiency and a better riding position for better climbing. And just so you know what I'm judging this on, I want the bike to be as efficient as possible uphill while still giving me traction when I need it on the climbs. And I want it to remain as open as possible when I'm going downhill so that the system's not getting in the way of how the suspension performs best. So diving in with the setup. Flight Attendant is a little bit tougher to get set up than live valve, especially for me. I am the world's worst millennial. I only recently found how to merge two calls on my iPhone for like a conference call. So if you're good at electronics, you'll have no problems, but there are a lot of like sensors and things you have to pair together using the SRAM app. So right out of the parking lot, it became very apparent that Flight Attendant is more noticeable or more stark than Live Valve. For better or worse, the differences between the modes are less subtle than on Live Valve. And I was riding in the desert for all of this testing, which is probably a difficult place for these systems to interpret what's going on, which for me makes it the best place to test them. The start of my climb, however, was a smooth, open, fast fire road, and the bike instantly recognized it and locked out the suspension. And as a side effect of that, it put me in a better body position on the bike where I was a little more forward or over the middle of the bike rather than sagging into my travel more, pulling me off the back of the bike. As I would encounter bumpy sections, the system would either go to full open or to that pedal mode based on how severe those bumps were. I struggled a little bit to find what criteria would get it to lock out or open up. For the most part though, if I was on flat, smooth ground, it was either in pedal or lock. If I was pitched uphill, it was almost always in lock unless it was really bumpy, and then it would go to the pedal setting. And if I was pointing downhill or if I was on flat terrain that was very bumpy, it would be in the open setting. And one thing I noticed is while the sensors may be picking up data and interpreting that data at a very stupidly, insanely fast pace, it seems a little more hesitant or reluctant to make a change in the system. Where Live Valve was very, very quick, you'd hit a bump and it would open. Flight Attendant is a little bit slower or more hesitant to make that change, where you could be on a climb, locked out, you'd hit a bump, and it wouldn't necessarily open immediately. It might take 1 or 2 bumps for it to recognize that you're in bumpy terrain and to open up. It makes me wonder if that's by design or if it's some limitation of the system. I'm not totally sure on that. So within the app, you are able to change the bias of the system, and the bias is just how frequently you will be either open or locked out. So by default, it's set at 0. -1 is going to be open more often. -2 will be open more often than that. And opposite, when you go to +1 and +2, it'll be locked out more. Because most of my climbs were very bumpy, I ended up preferring that -2 bias because I wanted the system to stay a little more open more frequently so that I could have better traction and control. I think for my trails up here or around home, or if I lived in a place where the trails were very smooth, that 0 setting would be nice. And if I wanted just the maximum efficiency and I didn't have to worry so much about traction, the +1, +2 settings would be awesome. On the descents, the Flight Attendant system pretty much always remained open. Even if the descents weren't very steep, if it was kind of flat or rolling, if I wasn't pedaling, it pretty much stayed open. And I think the pedal sensor is to credit here. And I even spent a bunch of time watching my GoPro footage zoomed in on the controller on the fork just to make sure I wasn't crazy. And the footage confirms that. On some of the less steep descents, and if I was putting in pedal strokes here and there, it would be in that pedal setting from time to time. Again, if you change the bias and you put it in -1, -2, it's more likely to be in that open setting in those situations. So does Flight Attendant hold up to my test criteria? I would say 95% of the time it's perfect, and I really like it and love having it on my bike. I do have 2 bones to pick, or 2 improvements I would love to see in future versions. The first being, I'd like to see it make changes more frequently or faster. Again, like I said, it's a little hesitant or slow to make changes to the compression. I don't know if it's a battery life thing, you know, those little servos are just going nonstop, you're gonna drain your batteries faster, or if it's a limitation of the system. Either way, I'd like to see it move just a little bit quicker. The second is I'd like to see independent tuning of my fork and my shock. On certain bikes like XC bikes, locking out your fork can make sense, although Flight Attendant isn't offered on or really designed around XC bikes. It's designed around longer travel bikes. And on a long travel bike, I just don't really want my fork to lock out. I love what the rear shock does, where it firms up, it gives you more efficiency, puts you in a better climbing position, but I just don't know if I want the fork to lock out or to lock out frequently, especially with Flight Attendant being a little slower to react. You do hit these bumps with your fork locked out, and you will be feeling that bump as if your fork was locked out. You add up 1,000 of those over the course of a ride, and your hands are going to start to hurt. So how does Flight Attendant improve the ride quality on the Trance X SE? I've ridden this bike a lot in the analog version as well as automatic suspension versions, and I do think Flight Attendant improves the ride quality. The bike as a whole is very efficient and it's a fast climber, but the added efficiency and the better body position because of it does go a long way in making this bike faster uphill. And that better body position on this bike especially helps quite a bit. On the analog version of this bike, I noticed the bottom bracket was a little low and I'd be smacking my pedals from time to time, which is not something I'd normally struggle with, even in the desert. But with the Flight Attendant version of this bike, you sit a little higher in the travel and the bottom bracket stays a little bit further away from the ground, which helps with pedal clearance. When it comes to the descents, I feel like they're pretty much the same. Again, Flight Attendant did a great job of remaining open on the downhills. Let's look at it this way. If I'm spending my money on a Giant Trance, I'm buying this one. I'm buying the one that comes with Flight Attendant for $8,500 over the $5,000 analog version of this bike. Not just for the Flight Attendant, you know, you do get a lot of extra added value in this bike, but I really like what Flight Attendant did for this bike. All right, Flight Attendant versus Live Valve, which one's better? Let's start this off by saying they're both pretty slick, pretty cool, and they can make the bike quite a bit better. Although they do work differently and they feel different, so they each get some wins. Let's just make this a pros and cons list to make it very easy and simple. So, Flight Attendant pros. It integrates with the Axis system, so if you already have an Axis drivetrain, it's all gonna work and play well together. And one added bonus there is if you have your Axis derailleur battery die, normally you'd be screwed. Now you could probably steal one of the batteries from, say, your fork or from the shock and replace the derailleur one. Do not want to admit how many times I have shown up for a ride with a dead Axis derailleur battery, so this would save me at least. The user face is nicer. It's wireless and it just looks prettier and cleaner. Flight Attendant is available on more and more bikes, and that is increasing even more and more with aftermarket options available for certain models. I think Flight Attendant stays open on the downhill better than Live Valve, and it's probably due to that pedal sensor. And for better or worse, these differences in compression settings are more noticeable or more impactful to your ride quality. Flight Attendant cons. Setup takes a little bit longer, and I think it's a little bit more finicky than Live Valve. It is a little bit slower to react to changes in terrain, and there's no independent fork and shock tuning. All right, Live Valve pros. It is much quicker to react and make changes to varying terrain. I think the setup is quicker and easier. The changes in compression are a little bit more subtle, which I think I would prefer. It feels a little more seamless rather than on-off with locking out, opening up. There are multiple rider options or profile settings within the app. And now Live Valve cons. The system's just more cluttered. You got more cables and it just doesn't look as pretty and nice. I don't think it does as good of a job as Flight Attendant at staying open on the downhill. I think it can get confused a little bit easier. It has fairly limited availability on the bikes that it comes on, and it is not available as an aftermarket for any bikes that I'm aware of. And it also does not have independent fork and shock tuning. I see Flight Attendant as a great option for probably 3 different rider groups. The first are the climbing freaks. They're the people who love to rip their friends' legs off. They want to be at the top of the hill before everybody else. They enjoy those terrible, nasty climbs where you are miserable and you're drooling and grunting, and for some reason they enjoy that. They will really like Flight Attendant because it makes the most of your bike for climbing. And Flight Attendant especially is good for these people if they've found themselves on like a longer travel trail to a mountain to enduro bike, whether it be for more confidence on the downhill or more comfort, or they're just looking to expand or grow into riding more difficult terrain. Flight Attendant's great because it will give them the efficiency and the climbing position and the uphill speed that they want and that they're used to in a longer travel package. They'll get the more comfortable, more confident bike. Another group of folks who I think will really like Flight Attendant are the set it and forget it folks. They don't want to be messing around with suspension settings. They don't either have the knowledge or the desire to be changing their compression based on where they're riding or how they're riding. They just want to set it up, never touch it again, but they're not happy just to leave it in open. They want that extra efficiency. They want the better climbing position. So those folks can have it. So spend the 20 minutes, get the system set up, and you'd really probably never have to touch it again, and your bike is always optimizing your suspension for how you're riding it. The last group of folks who I think will like Flight Attendant, and this one caught me totally off guard, are going to be the enduro folks, the long travel bike folks, and they're riding stupid, difficult ridgeline climbs to get to some big, gnarly descents. At first I thought, what does adding a little bit of efficiency to that bike do? It's still going to be big and heavy, sluggish, slow. It's not going to change it enough. And then I saw it as more of a body position or climbing position benefit rather than just an efficiency. Efficiency kind of becomes secondary at this point. Because the suspension's firmer, you're not sagging into that travel as much. And if you've got 170 millimeters of rear travel, you'd be sagging in quite a bit, which pulls your weight off the back of the bike, which only makes climbing harder and harder. Flight Attendant will keep you sitting up higher, keep the geometry better, and then the efficiency is a secondary benefit. All right, so that's gonna wrap up our video on the Trance X SE with Flight Attendant. Both are actually really rad, and the combination of the two is very, very good. In fact, that's going to be one of my favorite bikes for the entire year, which I never would have guessed. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.